I'm Oliver Davies, and this is the first part of the lecture on media platforms. Today we're going to be talking about virtual reality. Now, virtual reality lies at the far right of the spectrum of the virtuality continuum as represented in this diagram here. In a virtual reality, the user is placed within an artificially generated reality, generally computer generated, and so experiences a completely different world than the one which he's actually living in. At the moment, we're in the midst of the first really commercially successful launch of virtual reality technology. If we look at things like Oculus Rift or HTC Vive or PlayStation VR, these types of devices are the first time that we've actually seen this type of technology successfully launched and available to consumers. But virtual reality is not necessarily that new a thing. I mean, if we want to look for the very first mention of virtual reality, or at least the idea of virtual reality, we have to go back at least 80 years. And we find the work of Lawrence Manning, who first wrote a story back in the publication Wonder Stories in 1935, a 5-part story called The Men Who Awoke. And in this story, he anticipated, or at least he theorized about the possibility of a virtual reality. In his story, users were hooked up and their nerve impulses passed through a system which enabled them to experience a dream world or a dream reality. And if we think about it, this type of connection between man and machine is not that different to the one that we see in The Matrix, which is obviously much later. But still, this was all fiction. In terms of fact, we have to wait a little longer. Although, if we want to look at the first, what's regarded as the first head-mounted display, we can go back even further than Lawrence Manning, and we can go all the way back to Albert Bacon Pratt. Now this is the helmet gun. Patent number 1,183,492, proposed by Albert Bacon Pratt. Curiously enough, not that successful. This was a gun adapted to be mounted on and fired from the head of the marksman. And in fact, there was a tube you can see in this diagram that the marksman had in his mouth, and by blowing on that tube would fire the gun. I know you're thinking it's amazing, this never caught on. And you'll be even more amazed when you hear about the secondary use of the helmet-mounted gun. The crown section of the helmet, when detached from the base of the helmet, may be inverted and used as a cooking utensil, the elongated hood projecting therefrom for protecting the barrel of the gun, serving as the handle therefore. So not just a head-mounted gun, but also a saucepan. And yet, for some reason, the world has forgotten the inventions of Albert Bacon Pratt. We can go forward to the 1960s. In 1962, Morton Heilig, a film cinematographer, was very invested and interested in this idea of virtual reality. And obviously the technology at this point, we didn't have computer-generated worlds. So he created this machine, Sensorama, which was intended to give the user an experience that simulated a real-world experience. So in this case, you were on this seat and you had force feedback handlebars, and you had a stereoscopic display, so very similar to the head-mounted displays, sort of an early precursor of the head-mounted displays we have currently, and experienced a bike ride through New York City, and even to the point that there was a small tube, olfactory tube, so you actually got to experience not just the sights and sensations, but also the smells. I'm not entirely sure what the smells of New York City might have been pumped through here, but strangely enough, again, a little ahead of its time, didn't quite catch on, and so we have to wait a little bit longer before we see anything that really resembles the virtual reality that we expect today. In 1968, we see Ivan Sutherland, in the process of developing this idea of the ultimate display, come up with a very basic virtual reality system that involved wireframe graphics, and the headset was so heavy, as you can see in this picture, it had to be mounted to the ceiling. So it was too heavy for a user to actually wear. It had to be mounted, and this earns its nickname, the Sword of Damocles, much like the legend, as it hung above you. But this was really important innovation in virtual reality. So this was really a computer-generated world which the user can see and to an extent interact with, but very, very rudimentary at this stage. And if we skip forward just over 20 years from then, Jaron Lanier was a developer originally working with Atari in their VR research center, but the video game crash that occurred in the mid-1980s saw that pretty much wiped out. And so Lanier invented, or at least formed, a company, VPL Research, in the mid-1980s. A number of people from Atari, and they invested a lot of thought and money into the earliest virtual reality. So what we see here in this picture is the earliest attempt at a commercial virtual reality system. This was called the iPhone. So not I as in a letter, but I as in the organ. So iPhone, and these were incredibly expensive. The cheapest version of this was almost $10,000 for the headset, and the most expensive version was almost $50,000. And you needed pretty much a supercomputer in order to be able to run it. So we're talking probably hundreds of thousands in order to actually be able to make this work. On top of that, the headsets were extremely heavy. If we look at the headsets today, things like Oculus Rift weighs about 470 grams, and the HTC Vive is very similar. These weighed around about 2.4 kilos, so they're extraordinarily heavy and not very wieldy. So again, perhaps unsurprisingly, costing $10,000, weighing 2.4 kilos, didn't quite catch on commercially. But virtual reality was something which just wouldn't go away. I mean, it's something which people were very much interested in, and so we see here in the mid-1990s, Sega attempted to launch a virtual reality headset called Sega VR, which would be used in the arcades, but also at home with the Sega Mega Drive or Sega Genesis. And this was something which, at the time, the analysts at the time thought was going to be really successful. So there was a thought that this type of technology was going to be the hot thing for Christmas of '94 or '95. But unfortunately, it just didn't really happen. The technology wasn't up to the task. Sega VR never actually launched commercially. It only ever was available as a prototype. And the CEO of Sega was quoted later as saying, well, the prototype units induced motion sickness and severe headaches in users. So it wasn't really something they were confident of putting on the market. So how did we get from that to the stage of having commercialized virtual reality? Well, obviously the technology improved. A key component in that was the fact that smartphones came along. So we see the launch of iPhone and a variety of Android phones, and the economies of scale in the production of those meant that many of the components, which previously had been very expensive, so if you wanted these types of accelerometers or this type of technology, it was very, very expensive. But smartphones were containing these items, and the bulk of this that was being produced meant that the cost came down and down and down. And so what we see, for example, Palmer Luckey in forming the prototype of what would become Oculus Rift, relied upon these off-the-shelf smartphone components that are now within reach in terms of the screens, in terms of the technology. And that meant that suddenly the technology gap had been bridged. Up until this point, it wasn't feasible to produce a headset that had enough capability and was at least reasonably affordable. And that all changed. So we see the launch of a number of systems in the last year. And if we look at those main competitors in that sort of high-end virtual reality, then they're broadly similar. We have the HTC Vive, we have Oculus Rift, and we have PlayStation VR. The PlayStation VR is slightly lower in terms of technical capabilities, in terms of screen size, in terms of field of view, but it's a lot cheaper. So when these launched, PlayStation VR launched at $400, Oculus launched at $600, and the HTC Vive came in at $800. So very, very expensive. And but the big difference, even greater difference, is that, well, the PlayStation VR, if you had a PlayStation 4 console or a PlayStation 4 Pro eventually, you could, along with the PlayStation VR, have a VR experience. So we're talking sort of maybe $250 for the console and another $300 for the headset, or $400 for the headset. So that still was not entirely unaffordable. Whereas if you wanted to experience HTC or Oculus, you needed a high-end PC. So you probably needed another $1,000 to have spent on a PC, which meant that the potential audience for both was relatively small, and that probably explains why we've not had a sort of massive expansion of the VR market. And a lot of people still haven't been able to afford the necessary equipment to experience VR, or at least don't see that the cost involved is worth the experience. So the sales have been perhaps disappointing. I think probably there was an expectation that sales would be greater than this. We know that PlayStation VR has sold over 1 million units. We don't have hard figures on the HTC Vive or Oculus. Estimates are somewhere in the region of 500,000 each. The prices of all of these units have dropped considerably since launch, so it's now possible to, referring here to Amazon, but you can pick up the PlayStation VR for $200. You can pick up Oculus for $400, and the Vive for around about $470, $500. So the prices have dropped hundreds of dollars, which is going to help. The prices of PCs, obviously. The type of PC, the power of a PC is increasing constantly. So what was the highest end PC is now at a lower price. So we're seeing gradually the hardware catching up to the capabilities of VR. So it's almost of a slow burn. It's not going to be something like DVD, which is within a very short space of time in almost everybody's home, replacing VCR. But it is something which undoubtedly has a future. And one of the key components of these high-end virtual realities is the use of room scale VR. Room scale because it allows you not just to sit in a chair and look around and track your head movement, but also to actually track the movement of the player within a finite space. So all three systems offer variants of these. In general, the Vive is probably the best well equipped for room scale VR. There's been an attempt by Oculus to really catch up in this area, and also PlayStation is slightly less complex, but then price-wise, it's considerably cheaper. And this opens up a lot of possibilities, because if we have a clear space, we can interact within that space, and that opens up a lot of design possibilities. It enables you to think about games in a slightly different way. You need to think about, how does the player move? How can you create an experience in which the player's physical actions are translated into game? And so you've got a very different set of design constraints in comparison to a traditional game. So it's still relatively early days, and there aren't a huge number of games that have been wildly impressive in this area. But at the same time, I think that this is something which people are going to experiment with more, which we're going to end up with some very interesting experiences that derive from this. We see gaming obviously as one of the core markets of virtual reality. It's where we see a lot of the early adopters of the technology. But obviously virtual reality isn't all about games. We see serious games, whether that is training, or for example in this isn't a piece of software which enables you to practice public speaking and therefore lose the fear of public speaking. We see these as well as, and definitely business use of virtual reality is an important market as well. All about high-end VR. If we look at the total number of virtual reality headsets sold, then the lower-end VR, so for example things like Gear VR, Google Daydream, which involve you having to insert a smartphone into the unit to provide both the screen and the processing capabilities. These have outsold the high-end VR by a huge number. We're talking sort of 30-40 million units of these sold in comparison to the much smaller number of high-end VR. Obviously much cheaper, but obviously the experience itself is limited. We don't have this room scale VR. We don't have the degree of motion depth. These types of experiences, these types of hardware tend to be more limited in terms of both games or use of things like 360-degree cinematic virtual reality. That's not to in any way take anything away from them. In a way, they're kind of like a gateway device. You can find out whether you like VR and then decide whether you want to kind of move up scale and get something a bit more advanced. I guess in the other hand, this might also explain to an extent a little of the reticence of the consumer, because there's such a broad range of experience, from the lower end up to the high end. If your first experience of virtual reality is a Gear VR or a Google Cardboard or something like this, then perhaps it's not as impressive as you've been led to believe. So perhaps you're excited, you experience this, and it's like, no, it's okay, but it's not exactly blowing my mind. And if that user for the first time had experienced room scale VR and a HTC Vive, then maybe their feelings towards the technology, they'd be much more excited about it. So maybe this is also something which holds VR back a little. You've got this very broad spread of technologies and prices, and what you get at the lower end is not the same type of experience you're going to get at the higher end. And I'm not sure all consumers are necessarily aware of that when they use these devices. So lower end VR though is still very important and has lots of possibilities. And then we also almost even lower end than this. What we see with Oculus Go, which is newly launching from Facebook, obviously, and Oculus. This is a device which doesn't require a smartphone. It's got its own built-in screen and it's got its own built-in processors, so it's a standalone virtual reality device. You don't need to link this to a PC. You don't need to link it to anything else. It's obviously technologically not as advanced, even as the sort of smartphone technology. And it offers a very basic introduction to virtual reality at a very cheap price. They're talking about launching this at about $200. So that's obviously considerably cheaper than the cost of the smartphone and the gear, or the cost of definitely the cost of a sort of high-end virtual reality system. The jury's still out on whether this is going to be a good move. Is this going to be something which opens up VR to lots of people, or is this just going to cheapen the experience of VR and put people off from purchasing the higher end because, hey, it's not as exciting as I thought? Only time will tell. All wonder and joy with virtual reality. There's also a couple of problems that we have with virtual reality. One of the problems is that the virtual reality is quite a solitary experience. That's not to say that there aren't multiplayer games and we can't have experiences where within a virtual world we experience interaction with other people. But in order to use virtual reality, we put a headset on, we're removed from the real world. We don't really hear the real world very well. We certainly don't see the real world, so we're isolated, and we're on our own. And that, for me, I think is something of a drawback. It removes us a little bit. And if we look at it in terms of the type of experience, well, I think it's more similar to something like cinema, whereby we can experience it for an hour or 2 hours, and then we put it away, and maybe we wait another day or 2 days before we experience that again. So I think it's a very sort of time finite experience. In comparison, and we'll talk more about this in part 2, in comparison, augmented reality has the potential to sort of knit itself seamlessly into our lives in the same way that perhaps smartphones or the internet have done. So augmented reality seems to have a greater degree of impact upon us, upon society, upon people than virtual reality. And that's not to say virtual reality can't be successful at what it does, but by virtue of the type of experience it currently offers, and that's currently possible with technology, that's something of a problem. When we're wrapped up in virtual reality, we can't interact very easily with the real world. This photo is from an article in The Guardian of a journalist who attempted to work an entire day in virtual reality and found that actually it was far more difficult than he thought, not just in terms of the sort of screen problems and eye problems, but also just taking a coffee break turned out to be a lot more difficult than he thought, which again perhaps suggests that we're at a very early stage of this technology. So if you're thinking of developing something in virtual reality, and I'm talking here about the assignment, the first question really to ask yourself is why? Why is this suitable for virtual reality? Why should I make this in virtual reality than, say, a traditional game or a traditional movie, or what is the added advantage of this? And virtual reality does have advantages. It allows us to be very immersed in the experience in a way that isn't as possible when we're sitting there, sort of 3 feet from a monitor, and we've got the world around us. And there are certain types of experiences that really are very suited to that, I think. So if we look at the possibility for very intense games, things like horror, for example, is a great example. Horror is all about separating us from the world around us. When we're separated, it's dark, it's silent. That's when horror is at its scariest. And if we take that even further in virtual reality, all we have is the reality that we see in there. So I think there's a lot of possibilities to play with that. On the other hand, you also have to be aware that the types of game experience that you're going to build in VR have to take into account the limitations of humans. So if we take something like a first-person shooter, well, traditionally on a computer, our movement, which is guided by a mouse, is extraordinarily quick. We're constantly flitting backwards and forwards. We're spinning the character around. We're constantly looking. We can't really do that within virtual reality. We're going to look around at a much slower pace. So you also have to think about the pacing of the game and the activities involved, and ensure that they suit virtual reality. But hopefully this has given you a few things to think about. And if you have any questions, do feel free to drop me an email.